Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a massive, almost unbelievable historical puzzle. We're looking at how the British East India Company managed to conquer the incredibly wealthy Indian subcontinent. And keep in mind, we're not talking about a traditional nation-state conquering another nation. No, this was a private, shareholder-driven corporation that somehow swallowed an entire continent. It's a mind-bending story of fragmentation, fortune, and a civilization caught in a huge transition. Let's get right into it.
So right off the bat, we run into this giant, glaring paradox. If India was so incredibly rich, so culturally advanced, how on earth did a relatively small European trading company pull off a hostile takeover? I mean, was India just inherently weak? For the longest time, colonial historians loved to explain this away with a really simple, frankly convenient answer.
For centuries, the dominant narrative was this convenient colonial myth, the idea that India was just a backward, perpetually divided landscape that couldn't govern itself. You know, the whole Britain had to swoop in and bring order routine. But the historical reality? It paints a totally different picture. Pre-British India was absolutely not a broken land. It was a fabulously wealthy, complex civilization that was just going through a very turbulent political transition. To figure out what actually happened, we've got to separate the myth from the reality.
Part 1. Wealth amidst political fragmentation. This brings us to our first major piece of the puzzle, the rapid decline of central Mughal authority right after Emperor Aurangzeb died in 1707.
So, by the early 1700s, the imperial stability of the Mughals was unraveling fast. You had succession wars, vicious factional fighting at court, and provincial governors basically just declaring independence. The map of India splintered into these distinct regional states, places like Hyderabad, Bengal, Awadh, Mysore, and the Sikh and Jat territories. And out of all these new powers, the Marathas really emerged as the undisputed heavyweights of the 18th century.
Now, here is a crucial distinction, and honestly, it completely changes how we look at this era. Political fragmentation does not equal civilizational weakness. I mean, plenty of powerful civilizations go through intense decentralization, right? Despite the shifting borders, India remained an absolute economic powerhouse. They had highly advanced agriculture supporting a massive population, their textiles literally dominated global markets, and their steel and shipbuilding were world-renowned. Seriously, you have to remember, European companies didn't sail halfway across the globe to civilize some poor barren land. They were chasing unimaginable wealth. Just take Bengal. In the 18th century, Bengal alone was one of the wealthiest places on the planet. It was packed with natural resources, booming industries, and insane trade networks. Actually, the standard of living and industrial output in Bengal often totally eclipsed many parts of Europe at that exact same time.
And it wasn't just Bengal. Indian merchants were running these massive global commercial networks out of key ports like Surat, Calcutta, Masulipatam, and Bombay. These bustling hubs connected India to global trade routes that stretched from the Persian Gulf all the way to Southeast Asia and Europe. International business was booming. The staggering wealth was definitely there, but the political unity needed to protect it, well, that was gone.
Part 2. Exploiting internal Indian rivalries. The really crucial point here is that this immense wealth was split among regional powers who were way more focused on fighting each other than uniting against outsiders. Instead of spotting the foreign threat literally docking on their shores, these powerful regional states were locked in a brutal chess match with one another. The Marathas were constantly clashing with the Nizam of Hyderabad. The fiercely independent rulers of Mysore were battling the Marathas. Bengal was looking inward, and Punjab was constantly dealing with devastating invasions from the northwest. They were draining enormous amounts of money, manpower, and resources into these exhausting, localized wars. Meanwhile, the British East India Company was watching this fractured dynamic like a hawk. They were the ultimate opportunists. They didn't even need a massive unified invasion force right out of the gate. Their strategy was way more calculated. They'd back one Indian ruler against a rival, form a convenient temporary alliance, slide right into local succession disputes, and basically use diplomacy and bribery as precision weapons to expand their footprint state by state.
Part 3. Military and financial advantages. But hey, political division wasn't the only thing going on. Let's look at how this ties into the massive military transformations happening over in Europe.
While India was politically fracturing, European warfare was rapidly modernizing. The company's armies were built on highly disciplined infantry, standardized modern artillery, regular salaries, and centralized command.
Now, Indian rulers had absolutely massive armies, and some were definitely innovating, like Mysore famously used rocket technology, and the Marathas had this incredibly powerful cavalry. But a lot of them still relied on outdated feudal loyalties and decentralized command. And in the heat of a major pitched battle, that European military discipline was just devastatingly effective.
Then you add the sheer, unyielding power of the sea. Even though India had a rich maritime history, no single Indian regional power had naval dominance even close to Britain's. The British Royal Navy was the ultimate trump card. It gave them this massive strategic edge, the ability to constantly reinforce troops, protect their lucrative trade routes, and simply outlast their opponents by controlling those sea-based supply lines whenever inland conflicts flared up. And that brings us to a fascinating, if grim, reality. War is incredibly expensive. The British didn't just win with muskets, they won with banks. The East India Company had access to advanced financial institutions and deep credit systems back in Britain. European debt markets acted as a massive force multiplier, easily bankrolling these long military campaigns. Meanwhile, the Indian states were constantly struggling to keep their treasuries full because their revenue systems were being torn apart by all the local wars.
You know, it's so easy for us today to think of nations as these unified blocks. But back then, rigid caste divisions and hyper-local loyalties meant there was very little social cohesion across the subcontinent. There just wasn't a strong sense of a unified national identity yet. Because of that, resistance to foreign expansion stayed incredibly localized. Honestly, to an everyday farmer, a distant Indian king probably didn't feel any more legitimate than a British governor.
Part 4. Resistance and lasting impact. Now, having said all of that, it is absolutely vital to remember that British conquest was neither easy nor inevitable.
This was absolutely not a passive society just rolling over. The British faced grueling, incredibly bloody pushback. We're talking fierce resistance from the Nawabs of Bengal to Mysore's leaders like Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, the vast Maratha Confederacy, the Sikhs, and countless tribal communities and peasant uprisings. The British paid a huge toll in blood and treasure. There were actually several points where they genuinely teetered on the edge of total defeat. The outcome was never predetermined.
But if you take away just one thing from this explainer today, let it be this. The conquest relied heavily on Indian allies. Tons of Indian rulers, elite bankers, powerful merchants, and soldiers actively funded and fought for the British simply to advance their own political or economic interests. Without that local cooperation, and without exploiting those deep internal rivalries, a corporate takeover of a continent this massive and well-defended would have been practically impossible.
Ultimately, the British conquered India not because Indians lacked civilization, but because the region lacked political unity at the exact wrong historical moment. And once the company really secured its grip, the transition was incredibly harsh. A vibrantly productive economic powerhouse was systematically rewired to serve a foreign power. Traditional industries totally plummeted as new colonial systems of administration, education, and resource extraction were rigorously imposed. The fall of the Mughal Empire definitely marked the end of an era, and it threw the doors wide open for British expansion. But it also planted the seeds for something else entirely. When you take a socially complex, highly productive civilization and compress it under foreign rule for long enough, what happens next? Resistance. The very same civilization that survived all that fragmentation and a foreign corporate takeover would eventually forge a brand new, unified identity. And that identity would give rise to one of the largest and most powerful anti-colonial movements in human history. It really makes you wonder, does true national unity sometimes require the crucible of a shared adversary to finally emerge? Think on that. Thanks for joining this explainer, and we'll see you next time.